Hello everyone and welcome to another supplemental video, and today I'm joined by yet another amazing guest, fellow Trekkie and YouTuber Jessie Gender.
Hey, how you doing?
And today we are going to be talking about Star Trek novels. If you want to get into reading more Star Trek books, we've decided to pick 5 recommendations each for you to get into so you can explore the wider Star Trek universe beyond the movies and the TV shows. And Jessie, as you are the guest, I think you can go first. So what's your number 5 pick for your recommendation of a Star Trek novel or novel series?
Yes, okay. So, as you said, I'm trying to pick ones that are like good one-offs or like good beginning places for people to sort of jump into. So the one that I'm recommending for my number 5 is actually Star Trek Voyager Echoes. It's the fifth book in the sort of like back when like Pocket Books was sort of like doing numbered entries for each franchise. This is just sort of, it plays like basically just a random episode of Star Trek Voyager. But it's called Echoes, and the concept of it is just one of the most visually inventive and cool ideas that I've ever seen in basically like anything. So the basic concept, let's see how best to explain this, is there's this planet that for some reason I think it's like every hour, an hour-long intervals, it sort of shoots out and you can see all the different versions of this planet in all the different universes and myriad universes right next to it. So it's like all in a row, like kind of mirrors next to each other, kind of like that Inception scene where everyone's sort of looking at each other. And every time that happens, the population of the entire planet shifts to the next universe. But the problem is, in one of the universes, or I think in like 2 or 3 of the universes, the planet doesn't exist. So every shift, the entire population of a planet gets just left in space and for death. It's pretty dark. And so Voyager comes across this planet, and the story is just told so interestingly because it jumps between the different types and versions of Voyager universes. So it's like the way each chapter begins, it says time, the 88th shift, location, 2,542 parallel universes right of ours. So it's like listing like how many universes to the right or left of our sort of main universe it is. And even cooler sort of concept within this too is that only every other universe has a Voyager, because there was that one episode where Voyager met sort of like another universe Voyager, and that Voyager got exploded. I forget. It's the one where Ensign Kim like jumps over from the other universe.
Deadlock, I think it's called.
Yes. So Voyager only exists in every other universe, which is kind of an interesting concept. It's such a cool idea. I love this novel so much.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Who wrote that one?
This is by I have the book right in front of me. It's actually written by 3 people: Dean Wesley Smith, Kristen Catherine Rush, Nina Kirke Hoffman, I think is how I would say her name. My presumption is because they're like they jump universes so many times that each author probably like took a universe version of Voyager and ran with it.
That sounds like a really cool concept. It sort of reminds me of the was it Eye of the Beholder, that episode, where they find that planet that's, time's passing like hundreds and hundreds of times like faster on the planet compared to the rest of the universe. Sounds really interesting.
I always love like weird planet time dilation stuff like that.
Yeah. I always have kind of a soft spot for Voyager, even though I'm starkly aware of its big problems. I always kind of have a soft spot. I feel like it's kind of like the comfort food of Star Trek, where it's just very kind of, it is safe and maybe to its detriment, but I feel like it's kind of something enjoyable about that, something comforting about that.
Oh, I totally agree with you. Like Voyager is like, don't get me wrong, it has some really, really great episodes, but it's always the one that I like come back to where it's like, I don't necessarily need to like be like wowed. I just want to like sit myself in Voyager in like a Star Trek episode for a while. And that's why I go back and rewatch it so much.
Yeah, it's good for like quintessential Star Trek, just like a typical Star Trek adventure. You can just like pop on a Voyager and it's a good one of those. So yeah, that sounds like a really cool book. My number 5 pick is actually a series of books. I've cheated a couple of bits in my picks, but it's
Same
my
here,
channel.
don't worry.
Yeah.
You're not alone in that.
My number 5 pick is the Star Trek Vanguard series by a bunch of authors: David Mack, Dayton Ward, Kevin Dillmore, and Marco Palmieri. Hope I'm saying that name correctly. But this one, I kind of feel like it's like Deep Space Nine in the TOS era, where it mostly takes place on this space station, which is codenamed Vanguard, in this kind of hot point between a lot of like galactic powers. So it's like in this kind of contested system between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, and also it's very near Tholian space. And basically, the space station is set up there kind of officially as like a kind of diplomatic point and a kind of, it's just official Starfleet business, typical kind of exploration and so on going on here. But the true purpose of the station is that on a nearby planet, they found this like a very, very advanced genome that's like clearly genetically engineered, and it's like millions and millions of years old. And it's one of those things where it's like the sector of space they figure out is like teeming with like all this ancient powerful alien technology, where if the Klingons were to get their hands on it and things, it would be real bad for the Federation. So it's kind of like covertly they're investigating what's going on with this ancient genome and what's going on with all the alien tech to try and figure out what's going on and make sure that it doesn't fall into Klingon hands. What I really like about the series is that I kind of think of it like a spiritual successor to DS9, not just because it's set on a space station, but because the story also kind of does that kind of morally grey side of Star Trek, where it's not Starfleet isn't the black and white good guys, and when in their kind of determination to keep their mission secret, they kind of end up doing some shady shit and kind of hurting a lot of people in the process, which I find quite interesting. And I also like that it kind of follows certain characters and shows you a different side of the Star Trek universe that you don't always see. Like, one of the main characters is a journalist, and the only time you really see like journalist or kind of news media at all in Star Trek is like with Jake Sisko.
Or the gotcha journalist in Star Trek Picard.
Yeah. But the journalist in Vanguard is one of those people that kind of, he's like uncovering what's going on, like the true mission of the station. And so Starfleet's kind of like, it's in their best interest to discredit the guy and get him, is fired and everything like that. So it's like his life kind of ends up getting ruined by Starfleet. And it's that whole kind of, seeing another side of it and like seeing someone who doesn't see Starfleet as the good guys, I always find really interesting. But what I also find really interesting is that this novel has a lot to do with the Tholians. There's some great Klingon stuff in there and great Klingon characters, but I made a video about the Breen recently, and I really like the kind of second tier Star Trek factions who I think of, like the Breen and the Tholians and the Gorn and so on. So it's kind of like they've appeared in a few episodes, but they've never been like major factions. And so with the Vanguard series exploring the Tholians so much and kind of delving into their history a bit more, I've always found that really interesting.
Yeah, I love it when the novels do that, because then you can kind of get like, it kind of like extrapolates out like some really cool ideas that could have been in the show.
Exactly, yeah. So that's like the Vanguard series that I find really interesting. Have you read that one or heard of it? Or
I have read that series. It is, I also second it. It didn't make my list, but not for like, it's in my, actually we mentioned before we went live that I actually have a bunch of honorable mentions, so I'm glad that you brought up Vanguard, because that was in my honorable mentions of a series that I really love. Yeah. I also, the other cool thing about it too, is that the Vanguard series has a ton of influence within like the Star Trek literary verse just in general. Like all those authors that started that series are still writing Star Trek to this day, and if you go into, they have these like post-Nemesis Star Trek continuity stuff that's been kind of erased because of Picard now. But they reference the Vanguard novels even in the 24th century stuff that comes up. Like even one of the novels that I'm going to mention later on my list actually has some direct ramifications from Vanguard that come up within the novel as sort of like 100 years hence.
Yeah. It's really good, because Vanguard for me was like the first Star Trek book series I got into, because I was just like bumbling about in Waterstones one day, and then I saw like the cover art of the space station and the Constitution class and everything. I was like, ooh, what's this? And I just decided to grab the book off the shelf. So that's kind of like, that was my kind of gateway into reading more Star Trek books and things. But what about your number 4 pick? What's your number 4 pick for Star Trek books?
Well, my number 4 pick is Star Trek Deep Space Nine Enigma Tales. So this is by Una McCormack, who I will just say flat out, Una McCormack is hands down my favorite Star Trek author. I adore her so much. She is an author who, like, she mainly focuses on the Cardassians, but every time that she does a novel set in the Star Trek universe, she does such a great job of like weaving in political intricacies of the different species and sort of like winding them together. And yet also always making it like relatable on a very personal level to the people. So like there's always these big politics going on, but you'll always get like individual characters who are really feeling the ramifications of sort of the large scale political conflicts in her work. And I think that eye on both the large scale and the small scale is what like really defines Una McCormack's work for me. And I think she's anytime you see a Una McCormack name on a Star Trek novel, just grab it because I recommend it. But Enigma Tales in specific, this one's a little bit probably the hardest jumping on point for all the books that I'll have on my list, because it does sort of fall in that, as I mentioned, that sort of 24th century continuity, the Star Trek post-Nemesis continuity that is not going to exist much longer, given that there's some hints that they're going to try and blow it up and get it more in line with the Star Trek Picard continuity in some future novels. But this one's set on Cardassia. Garrick, in previous novels, has become sort of the head leader of Cardassia at this point. And Julian Bashir, who had been doing some Section 31 stuff in some other books, is kind of in a coma. And so Garrick is sort of dealing with the fact that, and the other thing that I love Una for, like she overtly makes the romance that Garrick feels for Bashir overt in this novels, and Garrick actually has a boyfriend as well in these novels. Yeah, I absolutely love that. And so it's sort of Garrick dealing emotionally with that, and while also having to deal with a radical shift in Cardassian culture, sort of like really highlighting basically that Cardassia is a post-World War II Germany allegory in this series, about like people like feeling like they want to have reparations for some of the stuff that happened during the Dominion War, and Garrick sort of trying to toe this line of like holding ex-leaders accountable while also knowing that Cardassia needs time to heal and move past like its fascist roots, and sort of like highlighting the arts. And the story mainly focuses on a professor who is highly regarded in Cardassian society as one of the leaders of the current cultural revolution and one of the thought leaders of Cardassia, suddenly being revealed to have done some pretty terrible stuff during the Bajoran occupation and during the Dominion War as well. And sort of Garrick trying to like wrestle with the sort of issues of his emotional compromise with Bashir being in a coma, while also trying to deal with like, what do I do with this person who's meaning so much to the cultural revolution and youth of Cardassia, trying to move past this like horrible past, but also sort of reconciling with the trauma that we have inflicted on other people and ourselves.
Oh, that sounds really fascinating. Yeah, see, I like that. Yeah, what else has this author done? Other books?
She has also done. She did the recent Star Trek Picard. The first one, Last Best Hope, I believe, which is sort of like the sort of big sort of setup for the Star Trek Picard series.
Oh, okay.
She's also done, she has a new book coming out next month, which I'm actually super pumped for, a Discovery novel that is going to be taking place during that year that Burnham was sort of missing from the Discovery crew in the 32nd century. Yeah, Never Ending Sacrifice, which is absolutely wonderful. She's done a bunch of stuff with The Fall. Hollow Men, which is also sort of like a fallout of the Section 31 plots in Deep Space Nine that she did. Yeah, she's absolutely fantastic, and I just adore her.
I remember like I said in my Lore Revolution that Ira Stephen Bear once said like the Cardassians were so good in Deep Space Nine and so well written that they could have had their own spin-off show. So all those novels being so focused on the Cardassians, it's like, yeah, there's absolutely a wealth of material to pull from there, and Garrick is always just such a cool character. So kind of having him as kind of like a protagonist in a story, I think that sounds really, really interesting. I like the sound of that. I'll add it to the list. I should
say too, just a random other tidbit. Una from number 1 of on Star Trek Discovery: Strange New Worlds in the original series, Captain Pike's number 1, is named after Una McCormack.
Right, that's cool.
Yeah, they did. There was a 50th anniversary novel series called Star Trek Legacies that focused on Una as a character, which was another one of my sort of random recommendations that was going to be on my sort of not on my list, but recommendations anyway, nonetheless list. But they gave her a name in that book, the authors named her after Una McCormack and just called her Una. And so when they brought her onto the show Discovery, they just sort of brought that up from the novels. So Una on Star Trek Discovery and Strange New Worlds is named after Una McCormack.
Oh, that's awesome. That's cool. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to see what they do with Una #1 in Strange New Worlds. I think it's like what the glimpse that we got of Rebecca Romijn as that character in Discovery. I thought was really cool. So I'm excited to see where they go with that character. She also appears in a book that I'm going to be mentioning as well on my list. Ooh. But my number 4 pick is a cheat again. It's not a novel. It's actually Star Trek manga. By various authors, and I think like this is one of those things where it's kind of like a joint project between like actual Japanese manga writers who are Star Trek fans and like American writers and Star Trek fans and things like that. It's by like a ton of different authors. Will Wheaton wrote one of the stories as well, which is like quite good. But I think they were working on, or it's like they ended up releasing kind of relatively recently manga of TNG, but the one that I've read, Volume 1, is all set in TOS. And I think it's really cool to see kind of Star Trek stuff done in that art style. It's just really appealing to look at, and, I quite like reading manga, so, like, Star Trek manga was just my jam. But what I like about it is that it kind of goes back to that classic pulpy side of Star Trek, because for a lot of people kind of think of Star Trek as, like, this sort of hard sci-fi, and then it's like 2001 and things, and it's not really. Its biggest inspirations were like, these very, very pulpy adventure stuff, stuff that was in like, Amazing Stories and those kind of publications. And so like Star Trek manga is just like the epitome of that. It's just like these really fast-paced, really exciting, really imaginative and colorful stories of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy and that crew getting into like these really weird, wacky adventures. And of course, because it's all, in a comic book, they can just come up with whatever. And so I feel like sort of tone-wise or sort of style-wise in terms of the plots and things, it sort of strikes a healthy balance between the original series, the show, and the animated series. Because sometimes the animated series went just completely bonkers. It had like some of the weirdest plots in the animated series.
Giant Spock, anybody?
Yeah. And so like I feel like the Star Trek manga kind of marries that kind of weirdness with a sort of, I don't know what the word is, sincerity, or a sort of
it's weird
grit.
Yet still feels grounded in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, with of the original show, and so because of that, you get some really cool stories about it. Like, and there's also some great like manga tropes in it. Like, there's one where the Enterprise encounters just like this army of mechs, because of course they do.
Yeah,
and they're totally like Gundam style mechs, like just like attacking the Enterprise and stuff.
Yeah, just around, and it's like a little piloted by little kids, if I recall, right?
Yeah. Who like give them the finger and things. Yeah. So like I feel like Star Trek manga is just what, because like a lot of the stories we talk about are like have all these great layers and thematic depth and character arcs and all that kind of stuff. But Star Trek manga is just like total fun. It's just tons and tons of fun. I think is what I really like about Star Trek manga, and because of how weird it goes and how wacky it goes, and how kind of bold it is with some of its storytelling. Like one of the first stories in the Volume 1, I think, is they do like a Borg origin story. Yep. And I think it's one of the better ones. Out of the ones that are out there, it's one of the better ones that I've read. Because it's one of those things where it's like, my problem with like the Borg episode in Enterprise was that it's kind of like, they are clearly the Borg. And I feel like, that would be a thing that Starfleet would write down. But I'm not too bothered by like canon stuff like that. But Star Trek manga has a story where it's like, it's just on the cusp of what the Borg, of the species that were the Borg becoming the Borg. And so it's kind of like, you could still argue that like, oh, there's enough wiggle room in there that they encountered this and didn't immediately click later on that it was the Borg, But yeah, I think Star Trek manga is just full of really fun stories like that.
Yeah, I totally agree. That Borg was going to be one. The Borg storyline was going to be the one that I was going to point out as one that I really liked, because it did have that sort of like, it was clearly the Borg, but it kind of like justified them and did something new with them that you rarely see with the Borg post like First Contact. They always just kind of were the same exact thing all the time.
What's your number 3 pick?
Well, my number 3 pick is actually a Star Trek Discovery novel called Drastic Measures, by I believe. Sorry, I have Dayton Ward. So it's by Dayton Ward. Not to be confused with Star Trek Desperate Hours by David Mack, because there's another Star Trek Discovery book that has a very similar name. I don't know why they did that, but Drastic Measures, it follows It takes place right after the sort of events of why am I blanking on his name? Kodos the Executioner. If people recall, in Star Trek: The Original Series, we learned that Kirk lived on a colony that was run by Kodos the Executioner, where when they ran out of food, Kodos the Executioner killed half of the population in order to help them survive. But then it turns out that they were rescued 2 days later, so it was ultimately for naught. And so that was sort of like a big trauma in Kirk's childhood that never gets brought up again after that one episode because TOS. But this Discovery novel actually follows right after that happened with Captain Georgiou, then I think a commander at this point in the series, and Commander Lorca, Prime Lorca of all people, showing up to try to deal with the aftermath and hunt down Kodos the Executioner, and sort of dealing with the trauma of everyone that was left on that planet after such a horrific event. And it's the one time that I think we at all see Prime Lorca in I think anything that's been released so far.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So it's nice to get some characterization for that version of Lorca. He's sort of assigned the task team to sort of hunt down Kodos the Executioner. And I love the characterization of him in this because, you know, he is sort of like being the more soldier type character, so it kind of fits in line with his characterization with his mirror counterpart. He's still a little bit more gruff than your typical Starfleet officer, but he does have a lot more deeper empathy than Mirror Lorca has, because he's shown to be really sickened and disgusted by what Kodos has done. So it's a cool characterization of him. And then you also get him bouncing off of an earlier Georgiou, she sort of has to deal with the administrative task of sort of like handling what happens with this colony after this and like dealing with the fallout politically from it. And so they work in tandem, and so you sort of see her morality be honed in a really cool way. So yeah, and also Kodos the Executioner, I should say, too, gets characterized quite a bit interestingly, too, because you sort of get this character as you sort of see in the TOS episode. I think it's the Conscience of the King. How he has it like he sort of views it as like, I did what was necessary sort of thing. And in the book, you start to see him start the beginnings of that rationalization, because at the time he did think it was worthwhile. But then obviously they get rescued like 2 days later, so it was ultimately like unnecessary. And so you start to see his like mental gymnastics that he has to do in order to like justify his actions to himself. So great, it's a great novel.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Yeah, I mean, I always thought like Jason Isaacs and Lorca in general was like such a cool character in Discovery. Right, it's one of those things like he's a great character. I feel like right up until the point where he's revealed to be from the Mirror Universe, and then I feel like it's not as good. So yeah, Prime Lorca, like a story about Prime Lorca, I think sounds really, really interesting, and it's an interesting event to pull from as well, going kind of a bit deep into Star Trek lore to kind of center that story around. But that sounds really interesting. But you mentioned earlier before, number 3 on my list is actually Star Trek Desperate Hours. Is the other David Mack one, yeah, because I think Desperate Measures
it's Desperate Hours by David Mack, which is yours, and then there's Drastic Measures by Dayton Ward, which is mine. Yeah.
That is annoying.
Yeah, and they came out one right after each other, too. They were the first 2 Star Trek novels released, and I'm like, Star Trek Discovery novels released, I should say. And it's like, why would you do that? That's so dumb. Great novels, but yeah, just so dumb.
And I also just started reading, or rather listening to The Enterprise War, which is sort of like, I don't know, maybe part 3 in this sort of loose trilogy, because that follows on Captain Pike after the events of Desperate Hours. But the reason I really like Desperate Hours is because I don't know what your opinion is on this, but I am of the opinion that in Discovery, the Spock-Burnham relationship, like Burnham, she doesn't need to be related to Spock to be interesting. I feel like she's perfectly interesting without being Spock's adopted sister. And I never really feel like... I liked the performances of the actors, and I think it had its moments, but overall I never felt like that relationship in the show Discovery was all that interesting, or not as interesting as it could have been, which is why I really liked Desperate Hours, because I feel like David Mack, for whatever reason, just found a way to make that relationship really work in the story. So the plot of this one is this colony. It's a non-Federation colony, so it's kind of like privately run and everything. And they're doing some deep sea mining and end up uncovering this like massive, they call it the behemoth, I think in the book, and it's sending out these like weird drone things which are coming and attacking the colony that's there and attacking the ships in orbit and so on. And so the Shenzhou under Captain Giorgio and Burnham and so on shows up to try and investigate and figure out what's going on. And the Enterprise under Captain Pike also shows up with Spock and Una and so on and so forth. And it's up to them to figure out what the hell this thing is and what it's doing, and should it proved to be too dangerous for them to take on, Pike actually has standing orders to basically, firebomb the planet from orbit to try and kill the thing, because if it gets off world, it could prove to be too powerful for the Federation to stop. And what I really like about the Spock-Burnham relationship in the novel is how it's woven into the plot in a clever way, because it's sort of mild spoilers, I guess, but when Spock and Burnham are the ones who actually get inside this alien thing, and they basically have to go through this series of trials which depends on two people working together to try and get to the center of the ship. And I think it's like such a simple way to like force these two people who don't want to be together and don't want to work together to have to work together, and they have to kind of expose themselves and become emotionally vulnerable to really understand each other and really get in sync with each other. And there's a really fantastic scene that I loved where they have to mind meld, because there's a trial where they have to go separate ways and they can't see or hear each other, but they have to do things in sync. So to get around that, like they do this mind meld where they kind of have to merge consciousness, and the book in that scene refers to them as Spock Burnham, as like one character. It's just really cleverly written. I really liked how that was done. But then there's tons of really great kind of dueling relationships throughout the novel, where there's also a great relationship between Saru and Una, which I really liked, where Saru, because he's sort of younger and he's a bit fearful and he's a bit resentful of Burnham being promoted above him to first officer and so on, and it's like he's just afraid of everything and he's constantly trying to keep his fear in check, and he actually connects really, really well with Una and finds this kind of mutual respect, and this kind of, it sort of verges on being a crush almost with Una, and there's like a really cool relationship between the two, and also between Giorgio and Pike, because Pike is very much of the kind of, we have to firebomb this planet because this thing's clearly so dangerous, and Giorgio's like, no, we need to understand it, we need to figure out what's going on, and that's like our last resort. And it gets to the point where like sometimes the captains are almost like willing to fire on each other's ship to, get their way. And so that's a great confrontation as well. And another thing that I also really like about the book is it, once again, I think this is just a thing David Mack does, but he seems to really like getting into that, well, what about the Star Trek universe from a different perspective? Because the non-Federation colonists, I think, are an interesting group of characters as well, because they're setting up this colony, but it's like not part of the Federation, and they don't want it under the jurisdiction of that government, and they view Starfleet as the military force which is coming in to kind of usurp control or take over their world by force. And again, it's just that perspective of Starfleet which you don't often see in Star Trek, which I find really interesting. So yeah, I really like Desperate Hours as a book, but I'll check out
It's
Desperate Measures. Yeah,
I
almost forgot it.
Desperate Measures. I lose it too. It was a terrible. The one thing I just to jump off of what you were saying about this novel. The other thing I like about this novel too is this was the first sort of novel that came out in this sort of like current era of Star Trek TV shows, and it like highlights how what I love about the current era of Star Trek sort of beta canon stuff is how closely they're connected and how closely they like work together with the actual production crew of Star Trek Discovery, because this book came out right when Discovery Season 1 came out, and like the names of the characters of the Shenzhou crew were actually named in this novel, and then the writers of Discovery show actually named them that within the show, because the writer of the book actually had to like flesh them out. And so it just shows like Kirsten Beyer, who worked on Discovery and is an executive producer on Picard. She was a novelist before she got brought into the she wrote Star Trek novels before she got brought into like being an actual writer, and so she works really hard to like sort of make sure all the tie-in media with Star Trek actually connects up really, really well. So and this is like the first inklings of that. Like there's just some if you read all of the current tie-in media from when Star Trek Discovery came out to now, you really see that there's a lot of close relationship work between the writers of Star Trek, whatever series it is, and the writers of the comics or novels. And I think that this was the beginning of that relationship, and it was just really cool to see.
So, number 2. What is your number 2 pick? I believe we're up to.
All right, my number 2 is back to Deep Space Nine, and this is going to be the beginning of the post Deep Space Nine relaunch series, Star Trek Deep Space Nine Avatar books 1 and 2, by S.D. Perry. So, like I've alluded to a few times, there was during the era where Enterprise went off the air, and before we got, Star Trek 2009 and eventually Discovery, there's this large era that's still even kind of ongoing to today, where the writers of the novels were like, all right, well, there's no shows coming out. I guess we can just like make our own continuity post Star Trek Nemesis and post the shows. And so they kind of were given carte blanche to sort of do their own thing. And the Deep Space Nine relaunch was the first of those. Now, each series got their own, like Next Generation and Voyager, and even a few like spin-off series like New Frontier all kind of dovetailed and interwove with each other in a really cool way. But Deep Space Nine was the first one. And this book series, Avatar, sort of like set up a new status quo for post What We Leave Behind. And so Kira is in charge of the station. Esri and Bashir are starting to kind of like deal with dating each other, but Esri sort of like, as you sort of see in later novels in this continuity, she starts to feel she wants to go down the command track instead of being a counselor. We see where that goes later on. And Ro Laren, actually, because Odo is no longer the chief of security, Ro Laren, of all people, comes in to become the chief of security.
Oh, cool.
And has a really, and she has a really interesting sort of friction with Kira, because Kira is obviously highly religious, and Ro was obviously kind of disdainful of Bajoran religion. So they kind of have, and obviously she doesn't really follow the rules all that well, and so she sort of is an interesting sort of head of security to come into this sort of situation. Obviously, she has some friction with Starfleet, obviously, and Picard figures into these novels as well, in an interesting way, having to deal with an orb that shows up. But so this 2-book series sort of sets off this continuity. There's like several, I think there's like 20 books in this continuity that are all well worth reading, going into like Enigma Tales, the one that I mentioned before being actually the last of this. So this is the first and the last. But the plot of this revolves around this sort of mystery of Odo sends a message back to the station. He's obviously in the Great Link, and he says, well, I want to try and build diplomatic relationships between the Federation and the Dominion and try and like actually flesh out our understandings of each other's culture. So I'm actually sending a Jem'Hadar to be a member of the crew of Deep Space Nine.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but then there's a little bit of a mystery behind that I don't want to get too far into, but it's sort of dealing with the crew sort of dealing with like the new status quo, all the changes on the station, and then also this Jem'Hadar sort of coming in and being like, well, I'm going to be a Jem'Hadar and not be a really great dude that I'm just sort of like forced to reckon with, and Kira sort of having to like justify this choice to the people around her because she believes in Odo and his choices.
That sounds really awesome, yeah. Especially the Ro Laren thing, because I think it was like when they were developing Deep Space Nine, she was supposed to be like the character that became Kira, wasn't she? That I think they were trying to ask Michelle Forbes to like jump over to Deep Space Nine and be the regular character there, but she wasn't able to for whatever reason. But that sounds really interesting. I'm especially interested to see what happens when Picard shows up, because of course they left on really terrible circumstances in the Next Generation.
Oh, yep, that does get addressed really in a really cool way. Again, I don't want to spoil, but they do bring him up. Also, I should say there's a second plotline that is Picard and this other new character, Elias Vaughn, who eventually, just minor spoilers, he eventually becomes the new head of the station, the Starfleet head of the station. I think actually Kira actually gets to be head of the station, but he sort of is like second in command. And sort of he's an old friend of Picard's who used to work in Starfleet Intelligence, and he wasn't Section 31, but he did some sort of darker stuff in his past, and so he was thinking of retiring from Starfleet. Kind of a very similar arc to Picard, to Cisco, but sort of is a little bit more of an experienced and sort of grandfatherly kind of figure in a lot of ways, which is kind of an interesting dynamic to sort of set up.
That sounds really cool. Yeah, it's almost like sort of season 8 onwards of DS9 in book form. But as you say, that kind of post continuity of like sort of post Nemesis or post DS9 era of the novels, I love that kind of. It's sort of like a mini expanded universe in Star Trek. I really like that all those novels are in continuity with each other, and that you kind of get like season 8 and 9 of like all the previous shows and some other stuff in between, which is why my second pick is actually one that you mentioned earlier, Star Trek New Frontier by Peter David. Is my number 2 pick, because for me this one feels like this was just like a Star Trek spin-off show that they couldn't make, so they made it a book instead. Because I think this was actually the first novel series that didn't feature characters from any of the TV shows. I think it was like the big first kind of departure where they're like, okay, it's not Kirk, Spock, McCoy, or Picard and so on. It's like a totally new crew, which I think, it was really cool, and there's tons of book series which do that, and it's a great success. But this one is, again, dealing with the Tholians post-Nemesis, where basically the Tholian Empire has completely collapsed, and because of that, there's all there's all these weapons going about, and all these factions that are dividing and trying to carve up the territory and stuff. So it's like a very volatile political situation. So Starfleet basically dispatches a new ship called the USS Excalibur to go in there and kind of show the colors of the Federation, so to speak, and try and bring some stability to the region. And I really like this book for dealing with the Tholians again, but it's sort of like, in contrast to like Vanguard, which was dealing with the Tholians, Vanguard kind of alluded to like the origin of the Tholians and how they got started, whereas New Frontier is like, this is kind of like the end of the Tholians as a power in the quadrant, and it's all kind of collapsing. But what I really like is that the way it shows kind of the internal workings of the Empire, because people have this kind of misconception about how empires work, that they kind of think it's all one uniform thing. Like, they think the Roman Empire is all like the same top to bottom kind of thing, but like empires work because they're made up of lots of different conquered societies and factions and things that have all just been integrated. And so in this series, as the Excalibur is exploring like the fallout of the fall of the Tholian Empire, it starts encountering all these like subspecies and subcultures and other subjugated races and things that were all kind of taken over by the Tholians as they rose to power, which are now kind of getting free and trying to escape or trying to arm themselves and claim some power of their own and so on and so forth. And because of that, it kind of, the style and tone of the series kind of takes on a bit of like a mythological kind of style to it, especially with the main character, who's this guy David Mackenzie, although he's like he's not human. He's that's the one. Yeah, he's got like it's like the Anglicization of his alien name. But him as a character, I also find quite cool because he reminds me a lot of. I don't know if you've ever read novels by a guy called Bernard Cornwell. No. But he mostly writes like historical fiction. And he's my favorite historical fiction author because he's like a guy that strikes the perfect balance between historical authenticity, but he doesn't let that get in the way of like fun. And he has like this kind of go-to protagonist model, which is a protagonist who is, always like a square-jawed tough guy, a very kind of typical sort of adventure swashbuckler type, but they're always like driven by passion to the point where as if they see a wrong, they've got to step in and stop it. But of course, in the historical context of all these, traditions and protocols and things, depending on the era, the protagonist ends up kind of being so passionately driven that they end up kind of blundering into situations out of their control and kind of getting themselves in trouble. And that's kind of how I feel David Mackenzie is, because the guy's clearly...
Isn't it Mackenzie Calhoun?
Mackenzie Calhoun, that's the one. Who's David Mackenzie? Who am I thinking of? I think David Mackenzie's someone else. I don't know. He's an actor or an author? Mackenzie Calhoun, sorry. I think like he's kind of a departure from like the typical Starfleet officer because he clearly has like an ego to him, and he doesn't like people getting the better of him, and he has a bit of a temper, and so he's kind of like lets his fists do the talking sometimes, and it's quite different to like what you expect from Starfleet officers, especially of this era. and because Picard turns up in the story and things, and so does Captain Jellicoe as well, which I quite like, and so does like Shelby and so on.
Shelby's his first officer, right?
And I think it's quite a smart choice in terms of it's a clever reuse of some TNG characters. Like, you know, in the Best of Both Worlds, there was all this talk of Shelby becoming a first officer for someone, and here you actually get to see that play out. Although the Jellicoe thing I think is interesting, because I'm wondering if Peter David was operating under the Jellicoe is bad sort of remit that that Chain of Command like was trying to do, but like in retrospect, Jellicoe's actually fine.
Yeah,
he's, like,
Jellicoe
totally
actually makes sense.
captain.
He's like, no, he's totally justified.
And so in this one, like Jellicoe, I think the intention was that he was supposed to be like the sort of curmudgeonly, like Calhoun kind of like higher up that's always like you know like wanting to get take down Mackenzie. But if you think about it in terms of like Jellicoe's actually good, if you operate under that assumption, then it kind of operates as a kind of Jellicoe hates Mackenzie because he reminds him of himself in a way.
Yeah.
Because like Jellicoe's totally that type as well, you know, where he does get blustery and he does get like a bit shouty and things when he's dealing with the Cardassians and things. So I thought that was a cool relationship. But yeah, in general, New Frontier, I think it's like it doesn't have like a set end, and it veers off into like tons of different like companion novels and side things and comic books, and like another writer took over it at some point. So it's like
and the characters actually pop up in other novels in that sort of like post Nemesis continuity that gets created. I also should say the two things that I want to mention on that, like Captain Calhoun, great character. He also has like a morally gray side. Like there's one book in the series where he's facing off against the Enterprise for some such reason, and he locks the phasers on the bridge of the Enterprise, and he literally goes like, I never understand why Starfleet puts their bridges right on the top. It makes them easy targets. Which is like a great point. The bridge should be in the bowels of the ship. And Picard's like, what the hell are you gonna literally kill me? It was really funny. And then also the mythological aspect definitely gets leaned into later on. Like the books start become named after like mythological characters like Excalibur, and Stone and Anvil comes up as one of the titles. And also, final thing I should mention, I loved this series when I was growing up because for all the reasons you mentioned, but there's also an alien character within it who uses non-binary pronouns, which is like the first time I ever encountered that anywhere, which was really cool to see. So, and this series is pretty old. It's from the 90s, I believe.
Yeah, I think
so it's like,
started in 97, I think.
Yeah, and it kept going up until I think they released the latest novel in the series like 3 or 4 years ago, something like that.
And obviously if you know Next Gen and you know DS9 and things, then again there's plenty of stuff to connect it to that. But I think this is like the best Star Trek TV show that never was. You know, I feel like you could easily just like adapt this verbatim and just drop it into Star Trek continuity as a show, and it would just fit perfectly. So I really like the New Frontier series. So before we get to number one, though, do you have any more honorable mentions on your list?
Yeah, I'll just briefly mention, you actually touched upon most of my honorable mentions, but I would also mention the Boldly Go comics, which are sort of they're absolutely really wonderful. They are set sort of in that little time period in Star Trek Beyond between when the Enterprise gets destroyed and sort of they're waiting for the new Enterprise to be built, and that sort of like montage you see at the end of the movie. And so the Boldly Go comics are sort of like Kirk gets control of another ship for the few months, and sort of the crew are all separated. Like Spock is on sabbatical on New Vulcan this is set in the Kelvin timeline, I should mention. The New Vulcan with Uhura, and they're sort of like dealing with their relationship, and Kirk has a new ship, and Sulu, I actually think, gets his own ship for a little bit of time too. So the crew kind of being split up in the Kelvin timeline, and I really loved the series because they did some really cool things with it, but they also sort of like managed to take the Kelvin characters and put them in a different status quo than just everyone on the Enterprise, and sort of explore them in a new way that way, which was it's not something you really get to see that amount of latitude be given anywhere else for like an ongoing series like that. And so I was just kind of like, it was exciting to see that. And then just to be really brief about this, I would also say the A Time To series. The A Time To series it's set between Star Trek Insurrection and Nemesis, sort of setting up the status quo for where we see things in Nemesis. But what I really love about the series is it sort of it's like I said, sets us up for Nemesis and like why Wesley was at the wedding, why Worf is back on the Enterprise and not in the Klingon homeworld, things like that. But also a lot of the stuff in this book series, while it's not set post Nemesis, and it is all in continuity with that post Nemesis series, and so there's a lot of stuff that happens in these novels that gets play all the way through that series, especially stuff to do with some Section 31 stuff and how Picard gets implicated in some of the Section 31's doings on, even though he's not directly responsible for some stuff. That happens in these Time to Be Born series, or Time 2 series. There's like 8 or 9 of them, and it sort of goes on all the way through the entire continuity.
So, number one, I feel like, this is just a guess, but I feel like we both have the same number one spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Star Trek Destiny, right?
Yeah, I actually chose something different because I knew you were going to pick Destiny, so I could talk about something else. But if we're being honest, and if we were trying to save on time, Star Trek Destiny is my number one.
Yeah, I think Star Trek Destiny might be one of my favorite. It might be my favorite Star Trek story ever. I love Star Trek Destiny. It's by David Mack again. David Mack as well is I think my favorite Star Trek author. But yeah, Star Trek Destiny is just awesome. It's like, to me, it's like basically the Avengers Endgame / Doctor Who Stolen Earth with Star Trek, where it's just like a crossover between everyone, like as much as possible. Like they just could pack in like as many characters from as many shows as they could into this one thing.
They even get Enterprise references in there, which is great.
I know, yeah, as well. They found a way to get an Enterprise reference in there as well, and it's like, but not only is it like all of the Starfleet characters, a bunch of like, the enemy factions and one-off aliens and stuff from the individual shows all show up as well. Like the Herodians show up at one point for like one chapter, which is like this great little sequence, and it's like, it's basically just the final confrontation with the Borg. It's like the ultimate confrontation with the Borg. Mm-hmm. And it's like the most epic kind of batshit thing ever, and it's awesome.
Yeah, I know. I freaking love it too. Like I said, they go. This is what I was talking about earlier, with like the amount of latitude the writers were given to sort of do stuff post Nemesis, and while we were sort of waiting for Discovery to become a thing, because this is literally like devastating. Like the Borg just out and out invade the Federation full on with everything they have, and it is really horrifying to like see how they like destroy planets. Risa gets obliterated and kind of destroyed as well, either in this novel or it gets referenced in sort of further novels, because all the novels after this series sort of have to deal with this devastation. So the entire continuity sort of like hinges upon this flux point. And yeah, as you say, it's just the Avengers Endgame. It brings in like I'm blanking on her name, Captain Hernandez of the NX-02 from Star Trek Enterprise actually plays a very important role in the story without spoiling too much. But then everything going on in the 24th century is insane. Yeah,
because like there's like a whole kind of subplot taking place in the past with the Columbia crew, and it's kind of like you're not quite sure what it's leading up to, and then like when it finally pays off in like book 3, you're like, oh my god, that's the coolest fucking thing ever.
Oh yeah, without spoiling it, that ending is, oh my god.
Yeah, it's amazing. And but it's like the 24th century set stuff as well is so cool, because it's like you have Captain Picard on the Enterprise E with like a brand new first officer and everything, and you have Riker and Troy on the Titan, and you have, I think it's Chakotay's captaining the Voyager as well by that point. Mm-hmm. And you also have, I think the best addition to the book is Captain Ezri Dax of the USS Aventine. Something that was actually built up in the Deep Space Nine novel. Like I said, there's so much, the continuity is strong with this novel. Yeah, the Aventine as well, like the Vesta class is like, I think like one of my favorite Star Trek ship designs. It's like so cool. It's basically like built around the quantum slipstream drive thing from Voyager. So it's got like this cool like sort of narrow profile with like but with sort of like, it's sort of like the Enterprise E's bum with like Voyager's saucer section, and it's like just the really, really cool looking ship. But what I really like about kind of her characterization is because obviously when you first see her in DS9, she's quite nervous and a bit shy and quite reserved. And so you kind of see how far she's come, where she's much more confident and sure of herself. But it's not like she's turned into a different character. She still has that kind of counselor-esque, empathetic core to her, which gives her a very kind of unique command style. And like she bounces off Picard very well, because Picard doing his sort of first contact Moby Dick thing again. through a bit of it. And so it's really interesting to see them interact with each other. But, I mean, I love Destiny just because of, as you say, like, it's cool that all those novels manage to have a continuity with one another, because the fact that, you know, they do something this big and this bold with this, like, ultimate confrontation with the Borg, that for the consequences of it to actually ripple out through other stories is just a really, really cool thing. And I love just how dark it goes and how kind of imaginative it goes. There's this whole alien race called, I think they're called the Kalier or the Kalier or something. I'm not quite sure how you say it. It's written in the book.
It's called the I have no idea. I listened to an interview where David Mack actually like stated how that was pronounced, and I've forgotten.
Oh, right. Yeah, because I call them the Kalier, but I could be wrong. But they're such a cool alien race, like, as a concept. And it's one of those things where, again, it's like, if you did this in a TV show, it would be like so hard to pull off just how this society works. But in book form, it's really, really awesome. And yeah, I could just go on like for ages about why Destiny is so cool. I just think it's absolutely awesome.
Oh yeah, like you said, like what I love about it is like it builds upon that Avengers Endgame bit. Everyone sort of gets brought into it, and as I said, there's so many different storylines that are sort of set up before this in the sort of post-Nemesis continuity. Deep Space Nine had an ongoing continuity. Next Generation had an ongoing continuity, which is like the Borg continually upping their game in sort of those books. Like they do a lot of crazy stuff, and then it all sort of filters into Destiny. Is like the big sort of crossover moment with all these books and series, and then it explodes out from there. Titan as well, like there's a Titan novel series that all flowed into this with, as you mentioned, with Riker, and then everything after this deals with the ramifications of this story. Like the immediate books after this for each of the franchises is like them basically going to the different planets in around the Federation that have just been devastated by the Borg and trying to help them out. And then you have the political fallout of like some of the planets being like, well, we didn't get blown up. Why do we have to keep giving resources to all these other folks who are just weighing us down, sort of thing. And then people who get forgotten as like planets that get forgotten in that as well. And yeah, it's just everything flows into this book series and everything flows back out of it. And it just is so crazy. Of a series. I cannot recommend it enough.
It's one of those things where it's like you want to keep talking about it, but you don't want to give away the best bits. You just got to get it, because if you're a Star Trek fan, it's just one of those things where it's like I guarantee you'll love it. Not sure. Yeah, I was just gonna say if not sure how this will turn out in the edit, but do you want to? What was your original number one pick?
Yeah, this might be a bit of an anticlimax, but yeah, my number one pick, if it's not Destiny, because Destiny would be my number one, but I know you're going to pick it, so I was like, I'll pick something else so I can rant about something else. And I'll keep it brief because I know we're going long, but it's Star Trek Articles of the Federation by Keith R.A. DeCandido. This is actually the book, well, they were building up to Ezri becoming captain. This is actually the book where Ezri does become captain of the Aventine right before Destiny. But this series, basically the quick pitch of what this book is the West Wing and Star Trek. It follows the character. It follows after the events of some of the stuff of the A Time 2 series, the Federation president has to step down because of some Section 31 chicanery, and so a new president, Nan Bako, gets elected to be president of the Federation, and so the book sort of follows her setting up her new administration and sort of dealing with the fallout of the Romulan Star Empire falling into chaos post Star Trek Nemesis. And sort of leading into like Star Trek 2009 stuff. Also, like just the myriad of a billion different like crises that are coming up all at the same time that she has to deal with as president. And so it literally is just West Wing in space. And then Captain Ezri plays a distinct role in the books as well as sort of like dealing with stuff out in the further reaches of the Federation and reports back to Bako. So it is really great. And honestly, this is this, like, if I was to ever pitch a Star Trek show to Alex, if Alex Kurtzman called me up today and said, Jesse, give me your show, we're going to make it, this would be the show that I would make. It would be the West Wing in Star Trek. And this book just perfectly captures like what that would be. And honestly, I think the West Wing as an idea just works better in Star Trek because you can sort of have that idealism that the West Wing had without all sort of the problematic baggage of it being like, yeah, we'll just ignore some of the terrible stuff that the United States government does. You can actually be idealistic. And so, yeah, it's like it's talking about politics and government, but still like actually feels like it holds onto those Star Trek values of like, hey, look, politics can actually be inspirational and work for people. So I love this book. It is fantastic.
I love the sound of that because I have always thought I've always been interested in a Star Trek story that did that.
Yeah, it is so good. And just below Destiny for me, for one of my favorite novels. And Bako plays a role in Destiny and all of the post-Nemesis books too. She sticks around as a character for quite a while.
So thank you so much for joining me, Jessie. I've added a lot of items to my reading list. I hope the viewers have as well.
I hope so too. Yeah, I as I've said numerous other times in other places, honestly, I love Star Trek and I love Star Trek shows. The books are quite literally my favorite place for Star Trek stories. I actually think the stories in Star Trek novels are actually way better than the stories in the Star Trek shows. And I know that's saying something, but I truly believe it.
I totally understand where you're coming from, actually. I don't know if I agree,
Yeah.
but I understand. But yeah, okay, so thank you for watching, guys. Subscribe to Jessie's channel if you haven't already. She does great stuff. But until next time, have a good one, live long, and prosper. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.